Welcome to week 4 of our class, The Final Days of Jesus. Over the previous 3 weeks, and then this week, and then 2 more after this, we're going to continue to walk through the last week of Jesus' life. Now, I'll just remind you, we've been using this work by Kostenberger and Taylor called The Final Days of Jesus. This is a great companion book if you want to pick up and read as you follow along with the class. So we're walking through the most important week of the most important person who's ever lived. This is the final days of Jesus, the last week of his life. Up until this point, we've looked at Monday through Thursday, and so now we're moving into what would be late Thursday night, early Friday morning, as we would reckon the days. And so today we're going to look at the first part of Friday, really, I was going to say tomorrow, but next week, as you join us, we'll in week 5, we'll look at the back half of Friday. But today we're going to look at primarily the first part of Friday. So we'll do, again, I'll remind you, you'll always be able to find this PDF down below, whether you're watching on the app or you're watching on YouTube. You can find this PDF, and you can probably even see it better if you want to pull it up even as you listen. So we're going to cover today, Friday, April 3rd, AD 33, and I'm going to sort of show you the pieces that, just real quickly, the pieces that we're going to walk through. We're going to begin with the betrayal and arrest of Jesus, and then we'll move to the Jewish trial of Jesus, the phase 1, which is really informal at the house of Annas, the high priest's father-in-law, and then we'll move into phase 2 of the Jewish trial, the more formal, where he's actually before Caiaphas, then Peter denying Jesus, and then which got that twice, that's okay. And then the Jewish trial of Jesus, phase 3, this final verdict, and then finally here, ending with Judas hanging himself, with Matthew's account of that. What we might look at what Luke tells us in Acts 1 as well. But this is what we're going to cover today as we think about the final days of Jesus, particularly as we think about the first part of Friday, April 3rd, AD 33. So let's set the scene as we begin to think about here, Matthew 14, that should be 26:47. I'll make sure I fix that on the PDF. Matthew 26:47 and following. What's the setting? If you remember, where we left off, right, is that Jesus and his disciples, if we can find it here, Jesus and his disciples have gone out. Well, this is not working for me. There we go. Jesus and his disciples are here eating the final supper, the Last Supper. They go out, they come to the Garden of Gethsemane. Right, this is where they've been. They've walked this path, and they're at the garden. And last week we talked about their time in the garden, and we ended last week with Jesus saying, hearing and seeing his betrayers coming. And so he's saying, it's time. Now's the time. Wake up. And so as we pick up in Matthew chapter 26, beginning in verse 7, it says, "Now while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with a great crowd. And went with him a great crowd with swords and clubs, and from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, 'The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him.' And he came up to Jesus at once and said, 'Greetings, Rabbi.' And he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, 'Friend, do what you came to do.' Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, 'Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. For do you not think that I can appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so?' At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, 'Have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and yet you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled.' Then all the disciples left him and fled." Remember, Jesus is at the Garden of Gethsemane. This is a place they've been before. This is late Thursday night, early Friday morning, after midnight sometime. And Matthew tells us that Judas comes, and notice what Matthew calls him there in 26. It says, "While we were still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12." What is Matthew doing for us there? he's highlighting the fact that this betrayal that's about to happen is not just coming from somebody random or even from a tertiary sort of distant fringe follower of Jesus. That the betrayal that's coming is coming from Judas. Judas, one of the 12. You can imagine Matthew, years later, as he's writing this, the anger and frustration that he must have felt as he writes, Judas, one of the 12. He is the one who betrayed Jesus. This is the ultimate betrayal. They bring a large crowd with them, a really big crowd with clubs, with swords, with weapons. They're sent from the Jewish ruling council, what we would call the Sanhedrin, the 70. He brings this band. Some of them have Roman soldiers. There are officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees that are there. And the irony here is, they don't really need all these things to arrest Jesus. They come out to Jesus. Jesus is going to make this point in just a minute. But they come out to him as if he's a violent man. That with all of these people, this huge crowd of people, and clubs and swords and Roman officers and officers from the temple. And there is an irony that this is not who Jesus is. Jesus is not a violent person. Jesus isn't trying to bring about a violent insurrection. And yet they approach him this way. Judas has clearly coordinated with them that the sign, that what he's going to do, he's going to kiss the one who is Jesus, so that they'll know who it is. That he betrays Jesus with a kiss. And Jesus, in Luke 22:48, asked him, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? It's where we get the phrase, right? Judas's kiss, right? The kiss of Judas. It's betrayal. But I want you to notice, as you hopefully read through these texts, we read Matthew's account, is that Jesus is not a passive victim here. That Jesus, as they approach him, he takes control of the situation. Not only does he tell Judas, do what you're going to do, friend, do what you came to do, but he takes control of Peter when Peter tries to cut off Malchus's ear. He takes control of the situation. He's active. He is repeatedly taking initiative. And one of my favorite pieces of that is in John's account of this. They come and he asks them, who do you seek? And they say, we seek Jesus of Nazareth. He asked them, and then he said to them, I am he. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. And when Jesus said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. They're asking, who do you seek? They say, Jesus of Nazareth, and he says, I am he. Well, what does that remind you of, that phrase, I am he? Well, it ought to remind you of Exodus 3, of Exodus 19, of Yahweh, the Lord in the Old Testament, giving Moses his name and saying, I am. When Jesus says, I am, this is, I think, often overlooked detail in here. Jesus says, I am. He gives the answer, and they fall back. This is what we see throughout the Old Testament when we have theophanies, when we have these visits of the Lord with people. When they see the Lord, when Moses is before the burning bush, there's a theophany, he falls back, he falls down before the Lord. That when Jesus says, I am he, the voice, right, the power of his voice, it knocks them down. I can't imagine what they all must have been thinking as they sort of get up and gather their things and brush themselves off and yet still proceed to arrest Jesus even after what's just happened. That we have here just a clear sign of the power of Christ and even the control of Christ. He knocks them on their butts with just the phrase, I am he. Do you not think that Jesus could end all this in just an instant if he wanted to? He could end it if he wanted to, but Jesus hasn't. He knows exactly what he's called to do. So he's not a passive victim, but Jesus here is taking charge. We do see Peter. Of course, Peter does this. Peter's the guy, the one sort of always out on the edge. Peter takes his sword and he cuts off one of the priest's ear, Malchus's ear. Jesus immediately rebukes him, tells him to put his sword away, and then heals the guy's ear. Again, I just want you to, one of the things I want you to do as we work through this class is again and again and again, to imagine what it would have been like to be there, to be in the garden, to see this happening. I want you to realize that what we read in the scriptures is a real account of real actions, right, of real events that took place. And to say, okay, you're standing there, you see what's happened, the guards are all knocked down, they stand back up, Peter cuts off this guy's ear, and then Jesus says, hey, we're not doing that, Peter, and then heals the ear, picks it up and puts it back on his ear, right? My sort of initial thought is there nobody there that's saying, hey guys, I think we're making a mistake? Because I think maybe this is the wrong thing to be doing. I think maybe this guy is the Son of God. Look at what he just did. He knocked us all down with his words, and he put that guy's ear back on. Right? It just there's the level of self-deception here is astronomical. That they have in their hearts what they're going to do. They come to arrest Jesus, and nothing is going to push them off of that. Here, Jesus again references the cup. He says, "Put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" It's this cup, this image of the wrath being poured out in the Old Testament, that Jesus says, this is the cup of God's wrath that he's going to have to drink. And then Jesus, at the end of this passage, draws attention to the fact that the irony here, that they've come out to him like as if he were a robber, as if he were a zealot, a violent person. That he essentially says, I've always been open in the temples, that this sort of stealth, this sort of force is unnecessary. But then he ends it in Luke, he says, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. And we see this imagery of darkness again. Jesus, again, I want you to see, he's fully in control of all that's happening. At this, the disciples flee, right? They arrest Jesus. He says to let them go because he's a good shepherd. He cares for his sheep. So he says, take me, but don't take them. He lets them go, and then all the disciples flee. And Mark gives us this detail that there's a particular young disciple who flees, and they grab his cloth. They grab him by the shirt, and essentially the shirt, he's able to wiggle out of the shirt and to run off without it. We don't know who that is. The presumption is that that's probably Mark, as Mark gives us that detail. Mark knows that because it happened to him. Sometimes the gospel writers do that. They give us a detail. John does this a lot. He says, speaks of the one whom Jesus loved, which we believe that's John. So rather than using his name, he calls himself that. So we think that maybe Mark is telling us how he escaped. So essentially, as Jesus is arrested there at the Garden of Gethsemane, all the disciples flee. They run from him, which then leads us then to the trial of Jesus. Right? Which leads us then to the trial of Jesus, the phase 1, which we find in John's gospel. We find it only in John's gospel. John alone gives us this hearing that is sort of an informal hearing of Jesus before the father-in-law of Caiaphas the high priest, a guy named Annas. It says, first they led him to Annas, and he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and teaching. And Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have also taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? And Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So he comes to Annas, he comes to the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest. John, again, is the only gospel writer who gives us this account. Let's look at a map here. Here we go. So they're here in the garden, and they're led presumably this path to the palace of the high priest. This is where he's going to also meet with Caiaphas. The assumption here is that Annas and Caiaphas are probably in the same vicinity, either in the same palace or right next to each other. Annas, this former high priest that he meets with, is a really important guy. He served as high priest from 85 to 15. He had 5 sons who served as high priests, and Caiaphas, his son-in-law, is currently the high priest. So he's an incredibly important guy in the Jewish religious structure. And probably is the guy who, when Judas came to them and said, I'm willing to betray Jesus, it seems that Annas is the guy that they put in charge of setting all of this into motion. And so it makes sense then that they would bring him from the Garden of Gethsemane down through the city to Annas first, to bring him to this first sort of informal hearing. And he's questioned there about both theological positions and political positions. He questions him about his disciples and his teachings. Right? Who is it that's following you, and what is it that you're teaching? Jesus says, why do you ask me this? I've always taught openly. Jesus reminds him, I'm not trying to hide myself. I'm not private in this way. I've always taught openly. Ask all the people who've heard me. Ask the crowds. They've heard me teach if you want to know what I've said. And at this, one of the guards standing by strikes him in the face. He says that he's speaking disrespectfully. Obviously, it's only in that guard's opinion. It's not really disrespectful. But he thinks he's being disrespectful. And so Jesus again says, if I've spoken wrong, show me where the wrong is. But if I've said the right, why do you hit me? And at this, Annas gets frustrated. And so he sends them, still bound, still arrested, to his son-in-law, Caiaphas, the high priest. This is sort of an informal hearing before the hearing that is about to take place. That they know, Annas and Caiaphas know that they're going to have a formal hearing. There's going to have to be a formal verdict rendered. That the Jews have some level of autonomy, some level of self-governance, but certain things like execution, they couldn't carry out on their own. So they would have to come to a legal judgment on their own and then hand that legal judgment over to the Romans and ask that the Romans execute the criminal for them. And so Annas knows this is the first step. He's going to send him to Caiaphas because they need a formal judgment. It leads us then to the Jewish trial of Jesus, phase 2, the more formal section in Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22. This is where Jesus is brought to Caiaphas. We're told in Matthew 26, then those that had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death, but they found none. Though many false witnesses came forward, at least 2 came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? And Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, you have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robe and said, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witness do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? And they answered, he deserves death. And so they spit in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you? So he's brought here from Annas to Caiaphas, his son-in-law, the current high priest, that word is sent out to the Jewish religious leaders, the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, letting them know that Jesus has been arrested and really calling them together for a speedy trial. The goal is that by sunrise, which is the earliest they could render a verdict, that by sunrise they would be ready to render a verdict on Jesus. They could take it to the Romans quickly before the crowds that were in the city for the Passover celebration began to gather, right? Before they all began to sort of throng about near the temple. They wanted this to be done. And so they come to Caiaphas' house, which is likely... I'm going to get rid of this for a second. Right, that is, Caiaphas' house is likely in this area, right on the Temple Mount. It is likely a large mansion. There are some, in recent years, the last 15, I believe, some archaeological digs that have unearthed what they think might be the Caiaphas' mansion, this huge palace there, the palace of the high priest. It's overlooking the temple complex. When Matthew and the other writers talk about the whole council gathering here at Caiaphas' house, it's probably not the full Sanhedrin, the full 70. It's probably, at least initially, a quorum, which would be 23 of them, that they have gathered to begin the trial. And as the night goes on, as they have this trial, more and more are going to gather. And all they need is to make sure that by sunrise they have a quorum. By sunrise they have enough people to vote for the verdict. And we're going to see later today the sort of final verdict, the legal verdict. But you'll see that in this passage, before even sunrise comes, they've handed down a verdict. He's worthy to die. And they're going to have to wait until sunrise to make that legal, to make that a more formal judgment. But throughout the night, the council is gathering. As they speak to Jesus, as they try to get the trial and verdict done before sunrise, they need multiple witnesses. And so they find these witnesses, and they only can find a few. And Mark tells us that the few witnesses they're able to find have contradicting statements, right? He says that in 1459. Their biggest testimony is that Jesus said he would tear down the temple in 3 days and raise it. Now, if you remember that passage, when Jesus says that, what's he talking about? He's not talking about the physical temple there. He's talking about the temple of his body. That he knows that after his life, his death, and his resurrection, that his body is now going to be the means by which people come to God. People are going to come to the Lord, not through the temple, but through Christ. And so he says, tear this body down and I'll rebuild it. I'll take it back up again in 3 days. He's speaking of his own death and his own resurrection. And so this is the only thing they're able to try to pin on him. But because the law requires 2 or 3 witnesses that agree, they're not able to charge him on these things, right? Because Mark tells us that these witnesses have contradictory statements. So Caiaphas here gets impatient, and so he presses in on Jesus. He asks him a direct question: "Are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God?" Knowing that this affirmative answer will give him what he needs for the death penalty, right? That if Jesus says yes, he is both an insurrectionist and he is treasonous. So Jesus says, yes, you have said so. And in saying so, he invokes both Daniel 7 and Psalm 110, both of these passages in the Old Testament that have messianic pictures, images that point us towards the Messiah. He applies both of those passages to himself. He says that he is the divine Son of Man who will sit at Yahweh's right hand and come on the clouds to receive his kingdom, right? He takes these Old Testament passages that he knows and that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, that the whole Sanhedrin knows, apply to the Messiah, and he applies them to himself. And so with this answer seals his fate, both theologically and politically, right? That Jesus theologically has just blasphemed. If he is not truly the Messiah, he has blasphemed, which in Jewish law is worthy of death. And not only that, but he's blasphemed, he's really treasonous politically, that he is claiming to be the Messiah, thus he is claiming to be a king, bringing a kingdom, that he is claiming that one day that the Roman Empire and every other empire is going to fall, and that his kingdom is going to stand. And so he has, in this sense, sealed his fate with the Sadducees, the Pharisees, with the full Sanhedrin, theologically, politically. Here's the irony, is that this is what the Jews have been looking for centuries. They've been looking for the Messiah who would come and to free them from the Romans, the one who would come and to bring a kingdom, but they haven't been looking for Jesus. Jesus isn't what they thought he would be. And so when Jesus comes, when they have the Messiah in front of him, even as he's in front of them applying Old Testament passages that they know, applying them to himself as Messiah, they miss it. When Jesus answers, Caiaphas tears his robe, right? Leviticus 10 verse 6 and 21 verse 10 tells us that the high priest is not supposed to tear his robe. That's not what he's supposed to do. It's below him. It's beneath him. But Caiaphas is so angry, so upset, he tears his robe that Christ's answer is unacceptable to him. And the Sanhedrin declares he's worthy of death. He says, what else is there? Is there anything more we need to say? No, this man is worthy of death. And so they accuse him of blasphemy, and they say that he's worthy of death. They're going to wait till sunrise to have the final verdict, because he's ultimately going to need that verdict then to take him to Pilate, which we're going to see he's taken next week as we look at the back half of Friday, as he's taken to both Pilate and to Herod. And so with this informal judgment, they began to beat him, they began to mock him, they began to spit on him. And what comes to our mind might be some of the passages that are mentioned in Isaiah, like Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6, that talks about the suffering servant of the Lord, talks about the Messiah. He says, I gave my back to those who strike, and my cheek to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and from spitting. Isaiah 52:14 says, as many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. He speaks here even further down, that he says that he had no form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. That as Isaiah writes, looking forward 750 years to the coming of the Messiah, he writes about what Jesus is experiencing here. The beating, the mocking, that even as Jesus is being beaten and mocked, this is nothing compared to what's about to come. This is sort of the precursor to this. But even as this trial is happening, they're beating Jesus, they're mocking him, they're spitting on him. They're blindfolding him, hitting him and saying, all right, prophesy to us. If you're the prophet, tell us who hit you. This is an attempt to humiliate him and to make him seem weak before his followers. While this is happening, we get testimony of the denial of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell us about the denial of Peter by Jesus. Rather, the denial of Jesus by Peter. Remember, Jesus has predicted this. He told Peter, you are going to deny me. And Peter yet denies. And I want you to see as we look at this scene, it is a scene filled with incredible drama, with anticipation, ultimately with tragedy that ends with Peter, this picture of Peter going out into the city in the dark, weeping, just as a broken man. This is what Matthew says, Matthew chapter 26, 58, and then picking up in 69. It says, "And Peter followed him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, 'You also were with Jesus the Galilean.' But he denied it before them all, saying, 'I don't know what you mean.' And he went out to the entrance. Another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, 'This man was with Jesus of Nazareth.' And again he denied it with an oath, 'I do not know the man.' After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, 'Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you.'" He was a Galilean. "And then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, 'I do not know the man.' And immediately the rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, 'Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times.' And he went out and he wept bitterly." So when Jesus is arrested and the disciples flee, there is, for at least a few disciples, Peter and John in particular, some initial loyalty, that as others left, they follow him at a distance. That John tells us that he was able to work his way into the courtyard and ultimately into the trial. He was known to the high priest somehow. We don't know all the details there. But John then is able to see Peter outside the courtyard. He speaks to a servant girl, John tells us, and he's able to bring Peter in. And so Peter's in the courtyard. John is presumably inside the house. Peter's in the courtyard. But both are, even by just being that close to Jesus, risking their lives. If their master, right, their Lord is just been, or is in the process of being condemned to die, they know that's what's going to happen. And so to be even anywhere near him is to put their lives at risk. And so there is this suspicion of Peter almost immediately. Servant girl recognizes him, right? He clearly had been with Jesus a lot, and she must have seen him with Jesus and says, "Oh, you must be a disciple." He says no, he denies it. The second time when this happens, Peter denies it, but he invokes an oath, right? He says that he swears with an oath, "I don't know the man." If you remember, what did Jesus tell us about oaths? Don't swear an oath. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And here's Peter denying Jesus with an oath. The third time, his accent gives him away. You got to think Peter must be terrified at this point, and so he does the strongest thing he can do. He calls down a curse on himself, and he swears, "I don't know Jesus." That at this point, Peter chose the path of expediency, the path of safety, rather than the path of faithfulness. He was paralyzed by his fear, by what was about to happen to him as he watched the trial of Jesus unfold from the courtyard. And at this, the third denial of Jesus, the rooster crows. And Luke tells us that when this happened, it says, "And the Lord turned and looked at Peter." Now, we don't know exactly how this happened. Is it that as Peter from the courtyard is able to look into the house at big windows, he's able to look in? Or maybe he's able to see Jesus even as the trial is going on, and Jesus looks out the window at him and sees him. Or maybe they're moving Jesus from one place of the house to another place in the house. And as he's bound, he's walking from one doorway to another, and he's able to look into the courtyard, and he looks and he sees Peter. We don't know exactly, but either way, Luke tells us that at this moment, Jesus looks at Peter, and Peter remembered the sayings of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and he wept bitterly. I think that as Jesus looks at Peter here, it's not, I don't think, a glare of anger, but rather one of sadness, of disappointment, of even compassion for Peter. Remember when he told Peter that Satan has asked to sift you, but I have prayed for you. And when you've returned, strengthen your brothers. Jesus knew this was coming. He told Peter this was going to happen. And he says he prayed for Peter. You got to imagine that there's pain for Christ, even as he looks out on this broken man who's just denied him 3 times. And again, I can't imagine what it would be like to be Peter and to be in the courtyard and at that moment to lock eyes with Jesus, having just denied him 3 times. And so we're told there that Peter goes out weeping bitterly. At this point, Peter runs away. He runs out into the night, into the sort of maze of the streets of Jerusalem, and he weeps bitterly that he is a broken man. Consider, Peter must have thought it was over for him. Here he was, he denied Jesus. He was no better than Judas. Given the chance, he ran away, weeping into the night. Which then brings us then to the final phase 3 of the Jewish trial, which is the last sort of formal phase. Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 and 2 says, "When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led led him away and delivered him over to Pilate, the governor. I'm sorry here. So at this last phrase, they take him from the palace and take him to Pilate. Now we're told that they take counsel against him. Essentially, it's morning. The sun has risen, daybreak has come. Now they're able to, according to the rules, able to render a legal verdict. And they take counsel and say, affirm what they said earlier in the night, that he's worthy of death, but they must send him to Pilate, right? They can render a formal verdict on their own, but they cannot kill him. And so it's important for them to send him to the Romans, to send him to Pilate, to have him essentially rubber stamp what they've done. And so they do this. They offer this quick trial, this quick verdict, and they send him on to Jesus. And Matthew here, right after this, gives us the account of what happens to Judas. It says, after the trial, right, after having seen what happened, then when Judas, this is Matthew 27, verse 3, then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, it is not lawful to put them in the treasury, since it is blood money. So they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. Matthew alone gives us this count of the end of Judas's life. Having seen what's happened to Jesus, and that he is condemned and is going to be killed, Judas regrets what he's done, and he tries to give the money back, but he's too late. Now, we have to be clear that this is regret. This is not repentance. Judas is not repenting of what he's done, but he regrets. There are ways in which we might sometimes regret our sin without true repentance. Now, why does Judas regret this? We don't know. In the same way that we don't know all the reasons why Judas would betray Jesus in the first place, we don't know all the reasons that Judas would regret this. Maybe he is having a change of heart, and that he thought that this would, by turning Jesus in, that he would sort of spur Jesus on to bring about the kingdom. Maybe he thought that. Now he's seeing that's not the case. That's not what's going to happen. Jesus is really going to be crucified. Or maybe he thought it wouldn't go this far. Maybe he thought it's just a way to make a quick buck. And now that he sees his friend, this man he's been with for 3 years, is about to be killed, for whatever reason, Judas regrets it. He tries to bring the money back, the 30 pieces of silver. It's 4 months of wages for a day laborer. He tries to give it back. And the Pharisees say, it's not our problem, man. You regret this, not our problem. We had a deal. He throws the money in. They can't take the money back. It's blood money. And so they take the money, they buy a field essentially for John Doe and Jane Doe, right? For strangers to be buried in. And then we see that Judas goes out and he hangs himself. We have a complementary passage in Acts 18 that tells us that Judas eventually falls and bursts open in a field. Probably what happens is either that the branch that Judas hangs himself on, or the rope that he hangs himself with, eventually breaks, and his body hits, and bloated from decomposition, hits and burst open on the ground. We don't know, again, all the details of the death of Judas, other than that Judas goes and hangs himself. This is where we are early on the morning of Friday. Judas doesn't even make it to see the death of Jesus. He's been betrayed in the garden. He's been brought to Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest, and then brought to Caiaphas. They have this quick, speedy, hastily put together trial. They declare him to be guilty. They send him to Pilate, which we'll see next week, and then Judas hangs himself, having regret over what he's done. When we pick up next week in week 5, we're going to look at the trial of Jesus, the Roman trial of Jesus between Pilate and Herod, and then ultimately the death of Jesus, the crucifixion, and what happens in those hours. I would encourage you, I'm going to throw these up, I would encourage you to take some time and to read Matthew 27, 11 through 61, Mark 15, 2 through 47, Luke 23, 1 through 56, and John 18, 28 through 1942 as you prepare for next week, and look forward to and begin to think through the Roman phase of the trial of Jesus, and ultimately ultimately the crucifixion of Jesus. I'll see you again next week for week 5. Thank you.